So tonight, what we're going to do is we are going to talk a little bit about CI3T and how all this fits together. And then we're going to talk about what we need to know in terms of internalizing behaviors. And I'm really grateful to have such a wide and broad set of experts on our CI3T crew. And in particular, I want to shout out tonight Emily and Paloma because they are both school psychologists. And so they've had a heavy hand in building these materials, and I'm grateful for that. And for some of you that are participating in Project Enhance, they are helping to build this entire set of enhanced resources, also done with Amy Breach. So very exciting. And so we will look forward to building on the things that Wendy and David and Eric and others have presented for many years. And I just want to make sure we give me another thumbs up if you can still hear me. I'm seeing a little bit of bandwidth that you just want to make sure. Okay, great. So we'll talk about internalizing issues, and then we're going to talk importantly about anxiety specifically and thinking about what we can do at each level of prevention, like at tier 1 for all, tier 2 for some, and then tier 3 supports for others. And listen as we get into that part about thinking about how you can interact with your community agencies as well, because there'll be some experts in your school and your district that can support you that have students with these tier 3 needs for internalizing issues. And so we want to make sure that you know when to connect within your system and when to move on to other areas. And then we'll start with a little bit of time to wrap up. So first, let's just start by saying thank you. This topic tonight is near and dear to our hearts. Wendy and Oaks and I have been working on this together for 15 years, thinking about how to support meeting kids' needs with internalizing issues. And even before that, Holly Menzies and I had an opportunity to start working together in the late 90s to think about how we can best detect kids with internalizing issues. And this is very, very important and often misunderstood. So if you were to take a picture right now, pre-pandemic, before the pandemic happened, in the picture of the school systems across the United States of America, you would have found that even pre-pandemic, there was about 20% of all school-age youth struggled with either externalizing or internalizing behavior challenges. And when we think about that number, that's a very big percentage of kids. And so think about your typical second grade, third grade, 12th grade classroom. And imagine 20% of those kids are struggling in some way. Externalizing behaviors are like acting out, non-compliant, whereas internalizing is like excessively shy, anxious, and socially withdrawn. And that overlap in the Venn diagram suggests that many kids have actually both. So what might capture our attention is the acting out issues. Underneath that acting out, you're going to see a lot of internalizing issues that may not be brought to the forefront of people's attention because they're masked, if you would, by the acting out behaviors. And what concerns me is that back in the day, in the 80s and the 90s, oftentimes people thought they didn't need to worry about behavior challenges, especially emotional and behavior disorders, because those kids would be served in special education. And the reality of it is that's 100% not true. Less than 1% of all school-age youth actually go on to receive special education services for these emotional and behavior disorders, which means the vast majority of kids that struggle with internalizing and externalizing behaviors are alive and well and living in general education. The good news is that we've seen this huge shift in the last 25 years. We used to look at a child and think, okay, here is what's problematic about this child. And now we've switched to the systems level perspective. So now you have systems that are integrated tiered systems of support like CI3T that allow us to build these very clearly articulated, positive, and productive environments for students and adults to work together. And one of the districts, and I won't name them, that we've been working with, they just recently had a site visit, and they did a beautiful job of explaining how they have CI3T at the district level, and every school has their own CI3T model. And they shared some really phenomenal data about how students have progressed academically, behaviorally, and in terms of social and emotional well-being in the last 6 years. So wonderful to see. And I know many of you on this call also have CI3T systems in place. And I want to explain a little bit about this context and how it is particularly beneficial for our work about supporting kids that have internalizing issues. As you know, the whole point of CI3T is to create clarities for everybody, the students, the families, the teachers, and administrators about what is offered to all, for some, and for a few. So CI3T is not something different than PBIS. It's broader in a sense than traditional PBIS and and multi-tiered systems of support, because it's actually broadened to address social and emotional well-being in addition to academics at the tier 1 level, and it's added to positive behavior interventions and supports. PBIS is 100% at the core, but one main distinction about your CI3T model compared to other traditional systems that are tiered systems is that we actually have a survey called the School-Wide Expectation Survey for specific settings. And David Royer, who's on this call, this is a particular area of expertise, and he and Katie Lane are actually working on a couple of additional papers that will contribute to that literature about how this works. But the benefit of that is that your expectation matrices at your schools aren't made by input from 5 people. They're made from input on all the adults in your building. So I know Carla was just leading a pretty large training event in Pennsylvania. And as people are thinking about building this system, that's one of the first things on their to-do list, just think about, okay, how do we get started in surveying people to find out what every single adult, the teachers, the social workers, the school psychologists, the cafeteria workers, the custodians, everybody weighs in on what's expected. In addition, through their building process that they're going through, and I realize that Carrie is also doing the same, as is Susan, as is Karen, they go through and vet the resources that are available to address kids' social and emotional well-being. So that means that at tier 1, there's a decision made on what validated resource to bring in that resonates with the value and the culture of the community. And that's what gets taught at tier 1. And many people will align that with the CASTLE principles, those big 5 areas. A lot of people will think clearly about, like, who are the kids that we want to graduate. They want to graduate people from their school system that are basically men and women of honor and integrity, kids that have self-determined behaviors. They know how to set a goal. They know how to self-regulate. They know how to make their needs known in a way that hopefully doesn't offend other people. So there's one resource that's pulled in. And when we look at that, like most schools across the country also have a bullying prevention requirement. Ideally, you lean into this system to plot those lessons. There's lessons, so they don't need another validated curriculum. And I believe their schools use second step. So they pull that lesson out, and that's taught and clarified at tier 1. And within the pages of each person's CI3T blueprint, these types of expectations for what the adults are going to do are all clarified. So the great work that Wendy has led regarding these low intensity supports, and many of the people on this call, like Grant Allen, has done a systematic review of active supervision. David Royer's done one on instructional choice. Eric Common has led another one on increased opportunities to respond, and David and others have, Robin Ennis, have done several on behavior specific praise. We want to make sure that we're bringing in practices that have enough research behind them to suggest that if done with integrity, they're going to yield that desired change that you need to help increase kids' engagement and maximize and minimize disruption. Also, in your CI3T blueprint is a really clear, respectful way for responding to challenging behaviors. And Rebecca and Mark could not be on the call tonight because they're in a class as they pursue their BCBA certification. But we want to make sure that we have a same instructional approach to responding when challenges arise. So we're going to acknowledge other kids, show empathy, redirect, give kids choices. And a big piece of it also is actually clarifying for people how those validated resources are going to get taught at tier 1. So the clarity on those resources is put into your tier 1. So when we think about supporting kids that are feeling anxious and kids with internalizing issues that we're going to talk about tonight, you should really seriously applaud yourself, because your base experience at tier 1 creates a framework where these kids with internalizing issues are at the forefront as we think about how to teach all of this in an integrated way, like using the integrated lesson plans that Wendy Oakes and others have created, and thinking about how we're going to acknowledge the adults so that we change the adult experience, who then change the student experience. And then how do we use our data to make decisions as to who needs more? So in your CI3T system, when we think about all the stuff that needs to be in place at tier 1, it is built based on the values and the culture of your community. They've all had input, including families, because families serve on the team, the CI3T leadership team, to help do that building. And when it's put in place, in fall and in spring, we continue to assess treatment integrity to see if it's happening, as well as social validity to see what people think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes. So you have information, and this is critical, on what is happening at tier one. And I look at people like Nettie, like even though she's brand new to her role, she's already leading the collection and the distribution of social validity and treatment integrity data, so that every school that she supports is in a place where they can see in fall and spring what implementation is looking like. And then when we know what's happening at tier one, now we can use these data that are collected as part of regular school practices, such as the student risk screening scale for internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And we can now use that information to make decisions about what's happening and what is needed at tier one. We can unpackage things by grade level, by school, and by classroom level, and we can use it to connect kids to supports. The value in using screening tools is that you can accurately detect kids that might need more than tier one has to offer if tier one is in place. And for tonight's conversation, we no longer have to guess as to whether or not kids have internalizing issues. We can be sure as to whether or not they are showing initial signs or persistent signs of internalizing issues. So before, we used to rely on office discipline referrals to look for kids that had basically tier two or tier three needs for acting out. But the challenge of that is in most systems where we did use office discipline referrals, it was if they had 0 to 1, they were considered having tier one needs. If they had 2 to 5, they were considered to have tier two. And if they earned 6 or more office discipline referrals, they were considered to have tier three needs. But the problem with that is by the time a child has earned between 5 to 6 plus office discipline referrals, sometimes people are feeling on the other side of constructive. So we know that we now have screening tools like the one you're looking at right here. You can look at the school's journey over time. And it also gives us a lot of clarity. Like we can see this winter to 2021 is the winter after the pandemic. And you can see that these levels were actually better than pre-pandemic levels. So it gives us an objective way to know how kids are doing in terms of acting out. And as I mentioned, we can unpackage this information by grade level as such as that you're seeing here. And if you were to look at this particular graph or this table right now, take a look at the percentage of kids at low, moderate, and high risk for externalizing. And know that we can do the same for internalizing. And I have to say, the screening tools for internalizing issues are a real gift, because honestly, we would have missed these kids if we did not screen, because they're not going to be earning office discipline referrals for certain behaviors. And so if you don't screen, these kids will be left undetected and unsupported, because the screening is how we make decisions to shape instruction for kids. And similarly, at this school, you can look to see this school's been screening for a very long time, and you've been doing what's called growing the green at this particular school. But there's also clarity, and you can't draw any causal conclusions on this. And I want to be clear, even though that school has been implementing CI3T all that time, you can't draw causal influences because it's a descriptive set of data. But nonetheless, I can look to see that over time, this school went from about 67% of the kids being in the low risk category to pre-pandemic levels being in, the 86%. So an 80% is our target for the school kids scoring in the low risk category. But I have clarity now on who might have tier 2 and tier 3 needs. That, as Wendy and I've said for years and years and years, it is just a screener. It's not a diagnostic. It's an indication that there could be a cause for concern. It also allows you to unpackage it, as I mentioned, by grade level. So again, if you would open up your chat and don't put your response in yet, but take a look at the percentage of kids with low risk for internalizing, moderate, and high risk. And I'd like you to think about, if you had to make a decision as about which grade level to push in on to support kids that were basically not responding to tier 1 efforts, what grade level would it be? And so far, everybody that said it has said 4th grade. And you can see in less than 60 seconds, you can see that I've got 65% of the kids responding compared to 83 and 90. So yes, that's 100% where I'd put my efforts. So when we think about this system that you've built, and knowing that you've been thinking about building systems to support kids with internalizing and externalizing behavior challenges, we want to take a little minute now and think a little bit more about what we need to know about kids with internalizing behavior patterns. And we've got a lot of expertise in this room. And I know some of you have logged into this call are social workers, some of you are school psychologists, some of you are mental health providers. And I'm so grateful to have so much expertise. And I know for some of you, this will be review, and for some of you, it might be brand new. When we think big picture about internalizing issues, it's a pretty diverse group of behaviors. Some of them are behaviors that show up as being anxious or having anxiety. There's depression, there's social withdrawal, and there's that feeling of somatic complaints, like where it feels like my body's hurting and the pain is real. You're not saying it's in their head, but it's a physical manifestation of an underlying challenge. When we think about these, and you'll notice that these are all overlapping. So oftentimes they cluster together in various combinations. And these show up in different ways, such as panic disorders and obsessive compulsive disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, social phobias, very specific phobias, as well as just like a generalized anxiety. And while the symptoms of each of these disorders are different, the commonality in these that kind of threads through is the through line is this excessive and or irrational level of fear or worry. And so those are common manifestations across those. And when we think about what we just talked about at the very beginning, if we've got about 20% of school-age kids that have mild to severe challenges in these areas, this is a big group. We should pay attention to it. And when we think about another lens, another way to slice this and piece of information, we also know that about 30% of all kids experience some type of anxiety disorder at some point during adolescence. For those of you on this call that are at middle school and high school levels, we really need to be paying attention because it's not like they age out of these challenges. So we need to make sure that all of the adults in the building, particularly the educators that work with kids, are prepared to know how to find these kids and how to support them. And we want to be cautious with this. And we've all got too many sad stories of, things that have happened where, kids have become a danger to themselves. So we want to make sure that we are aware. And one thing that we'd really like to make you aware of is just recently, there was the Surgeon General in 2021 issued this call basically for supporting kids in terms of mental health. And this reminds me very much of a call to action in 2001, where the Surgeon General actually issued a call to dismantle antisocial networks. So it was like in the early 2000s, they were really paying attention to a lot about antisocial networks, like the externalizing behavior patterns and the importance of how to do that and how to quickly detect kids. And now we're prioritizing in this post-pandemic, what I'd like to call it post-pandemic era, that we've seen increased rates of psychological distress. And we know that it's not equal across all groups of kids. And we know that some kids, different groups of kids, are being differentially impacted. And as you think about that report, it's going to help us to understand a little bit more about what things look like, what it's going to show up and what we can do about it. So when we focus tonight on anxiety, I'd like us to think a little bit about what that looks like. And in brief, we can see that for some kids, it shows up as being easily overwhelmed. So even small things can feel like very big things. And sometimes it's showing up as obsessive or intrusive thoughts. And you hear kids say things like, I can't get this out of my head. For some kids, it shows up as physical manifestations. It's headaches, it's body aches, it's nurse visits, it's feeling like things are so uncomfortable. It could be stomach aches. And there's this overwhelming sense of dread. And when we think about these things for kids, I'd like you to think about how hard it is for them to suit up, show up, and come to school when this is the backdrop, when you're feeling on heightened alert and easily overwhelmed and fatigued from the physical pain. It is really, really hard to concentrate. And there is, a lot of kids have experienced a tremendous amount of loss in this pandemic. And we want to make sure that we are looking at this, taking these concerns seriously, and we're being prepared to address this at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, depending on the needs. And the reason why we want to think about this too in a school setting, sometimes people have said, especially recently, should we be tackling this in schools? And I would say absolutely overwhelmingly, yes. This is like the schools are the hub. This is where kids are for the vast majority of their days. And if we don't check this, it's not only going to be bad for kids in terms of negative social outcomes, it's also going to be bad for academic outcomes, because when all these things are happening in our head and in our body, it's very, very hard to concentrate. So we know that those internalizing behaviors lead to a lot of challenges, like social and academic issues, as well as behavioral issues. And we have partnered with many people and some of you and some of your districts, and we've learned that those FABI scores for internalizing issues actually predict for kids, like how many nurses visits they contact in a year. And it's not that the nurse is bad, but the fact that the kids If they need to be in the nurse visit that often, they're missing instruction. And we know that those same internalizing fall scores predict how kids end the year in terms of reading, in terms of oral reading fluency. So we know that things don't get better for these kids over the course of a year. We need to think carefully about how to best support them. Once you've built a CI3T system, you have screening data that lets you know what's on deck in terms of internalizing and externalizing. And I again, don't want to name anybody in particular, but I'm watching such good decision making at district levels where people are really making good conscious decisions about what to bring in for screening, because we don't want to bring in a tool where we can't figure out which kids are actually indeed struggling with internalizing behavior issues. And so as we're thinking about these important debates right now, about, strengths-based screeners and those that are more deficit, which this one is, like the one that we're talking about tonight, like the student risk screening scale, those scores, though, are predicting really important outcomes for kids. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're all on the same page that we want to know how to support kids wherever they are. So at tier 1, at tier 2, or tier 3. And so when we think today about the whole impact, the whole idea about how we're going to work within the CI3T model of prevention to prevent and respond to kids that have internalizing issues, I want you to know it's very, very well aligned with many of the recommendations in that report that I hope you'll take a look at on the U.S. Surgeon General. Some of the things that they talk about building in terms of structures to meet kids' needs is creating these very safe, positive, and affirming environments. So that whole even commitment to social emotional well-being at tier 1, taking the time to explicitly teach that, just like you teach behavioral expectations, just like you teach writing and just like you teach reading and math, is critical. And that we want to make sure that you are looking at resources that have enough evidence behind them to know that if you do those with fidelity, you're going to get a certain return. It is very, very tempting to take things that are bright and shiny or new or free that don't have a lot of evidence behind them. But this is our kids' well-being and it's our teachers' well-being as well. So we want to make sure that we're firmly invested in that. And we also want to make sure that you notice in here that one of the recommendations is to know the changes in how it's presenting for kids. And you guys already have that if your school is doing CI3T. You already have an opportunity to look at data that you've already been collecting. And I can say at the district level in many of your schools, that was one of the biggest sighs of relief, is knowing you had a blueprint and you had screening data to know how to connect kids to supports, with this idea that we want to make sure it's evidence-based practices at each level of prevention. So when we think about data and thinking about the levels of supports that we have right now, there's a number of interventions that you could choose to take a peek at right now that can be done in a preventative nature at tier 1. And there's others that are available at tier 2 and at tier 3, and some of which can thread through. So things like relaxation training can be helpful for kids at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So tonight, when we think about, and these lists that are shared with you right now are from a wonderful researcher, her name is Kimberly Van Est. And when we think about the things that are out there, the good news is there are approaches that can be used at each level of prevention. And what we want to do right now is give a little bit of an overview of several of these. So one of which is called relaxation training, and this can be used across the tiers. And the teacher actually takes time to teach students about ways to learn how to be relaxed and to be aware of how their body feels. And this is done by monitoring like the level of tension created by stressful situations and then controlling it with regular breathing. The whole point of this guided relaxation is that it's going to lower anxiety through this physiological response to slower breathing and slower thinking. And when we do this as a tier 1 support or at tier 2 or tier 3, we want to think about identifying situations that might be stressful for a kid. It could be kids that are coming back to school that are away from family members for the first time. It could be before the state assessments are happening. It could be before a big sporting event. And then we want to think about providing options for relaxation training based on that student's strengths and interest. And then this is actually taught the same way we treat academics, through modeling, practice, and feedback. And the reason why we want to teach them to be able to see what their body feels like when it's feeling particularly tense or uncomfortable is that holding your breath and uneven breathing or short breathing or, clenching your fists or shrugging your shoulders are all things that can exacerbate those common anxiety systems and cause people to become even more anxious. So some of the specific techniques include counting or pattern counting or breathing exercises. You might read about them as like bubble breathing, doing some guided imagery. So picturing in your mind a place that brings you great joy or makes you feel very comfortable. Like for me, it's always my grandparents' backyard. I have the happiest memories of just even sitting on the grass in the backyard. And this idea of progressive muscle relaxation. So I am going to stop sharing my screen now. And Katie Austin is going to take a moment and she's going to pull this up, and we're going to give you an opportunity to just take a quick listen to this audio tape. And if you would like this is in the presentation and it is downloadable, and all you need to do is push play. So Katie, thanks for pulling that up.
And if you guys will just give me a thumbs up when I start playing it to let me know that you can hear it, okay?
We're going to begin the steps in relaxation training. Take a deep breath in. Hold it for about 10 seconds. Hold it. Okay, let it out. Raise both your hands about halfway above your seat. Breathe normally. Now drop your hands. Now hold your arms out about halfway and make tight fists. Really tight. Feel the tension in your hands. I'm going to count to 3, and when I say 3, I want you to drop your hands. 1, 2, 3. Now raise your arms again. Bend your fingers back the other way toward your body. Now drop your hands and relax. Now raise your arms. Now drop them and relax. Now raise your arms again, but this time, flap your hands around. Okay, relax again. Raise your arms again. Now relax. Raise your arms above your seat. Now tense your biceps. Breathe normally and keep your hands loose. Relax your hands. Notice how you have a warming feeling of relaxation. Now hold your arms out to your side and tense your biceps. Make sure you're breathing normally.
Good. And as you listen to that, and that was recorded by Emily Cantwell. I know some of you know her and had the opportunity to work with her. This is an audio recording. You're welcome to it. You might choose to make your own, and many books actually have these. And so you might think about making a bank of these. One way you might do these is think about planned times during the day when kids come in with higher than average anxiety, or even higher than average behavior that is a little bit more on the acting outside. As a teacher, if I was teaching in the pandemic era, I would start my day with this. When kids came in, I would do a starter activity on the board. I would probably have something up like 2 journal prompts. I would ask them to pick one to write about. And when my whole class was settled and that was done, I would start with this. I would remind kids of the safety routines, and then I would begin my instruction. I might also think about building something like this in before kids make another major transition, either in from recess or lunch, or before heading out for the day, or at the end of the day at the high school level. And the idea behind this simply is that this is something that I can do to set an even, calm, comfortable place and space for all kids to be in. And I think these can be really nice. And so this might be something that you would decide to add to your repertoire. On this next slide, we are going to see an example of a tier 2 grid. And when we think now about if we were doing something like this at tier 1, I want you to imagine that what you're doing in your building might be you have your social and emotional well-being curriculum. You might have specific lessons that are about how to recognize what your body feels like, about how to respond to stress, about how to manage those feelings of anxiousness. I might do things at tier 1. I might bring in that guided relaxation. And then I do need to have a plan for things that are available to students that need more than tier 1 has to offer. So one of the things might be a self-monitoring type intervention for kids that have those higher than average internalizing issues. And when we think about doing this, thanks for the suggestion, Hope. When we think about doing this, ideally, remember, you're looking at your intervention grid. So if you are at a CI3T school and you have a tier 2 intervention grid, and you would look to see what you have in there in terms of inclusion criteria for kids that have tier 2 needs, you can find these specific resources for self-monitoring, the ones I'm going to show you just now. They're under the professional learning tab under self-monitoring. And this is a very common self-management strategy. And this can be self-monitoring in anything. And it can be definitely used for kids with internalizing issues. We're going to encourage you not to monitor the anxious behavior, but more about the replacement behavior and the use of strategies. Like, am I using the strategies that I've been taught to use when I'm recognizing that my body is feeling anxious? And so we want to know how to observe them and record them and monitor them. The benefit of doing self-monitoring is that it's very easy, it's convenient, it has high social validity. Students really enjoy this, and it actually promotes self-determined behaviors in the sense of helping them to be independent, because it's giving them something to have control over. And they learn that just by virtue of monitoring your behavior, you are able to shift it. And it has very positive outcomes in terms of impacting academic and other behaviors, like using certain strategies and monitoring like my breathing and things like that. On those tips, and Wendy went ahead and thank you again, Wendy, put that professional learning tab there. When you download that, you can do a one-click and download everything, or you can download individual items. What I'm showing you right now is a set of steps that you can work through to figure out, is this a good intervention for a certain student? You want to make sure it's developmentally appropriate. We define the behavior. And ideally, we don't want to focus on kids monitoring being anxious, because we want to make sure that we're focusing on a more productive behavior that is in direct competition to that. We can design the self-monitoring procedures, including the form that they're going to use. And we want to make sure that the kid is able to be aware of the behavior. It is developmentally appropriate, and it's not designed for particularly super, super young kids. And of course, we want to teach them how to do it, monitor student progress, and then we want to assess how that is going for them. And so you'll see a couple different illustrations on the website of what those forms might look like. And in your grids, it might look something like this. And remember, if you don't have self-monitoring as an option, you can simply download these and edit them. But in general, these are designed for kids that are showing up in the moderate risk category. And these give you some ideas about what to monitor in terms of the student performance, the treatment integrity, and the social validity. And when we think about those self-monitoring interventions specifically for internalizing behaviors, we do want to teach them to recognize, what does their body feel like when they're feeling anxious? Is it shortness of breath? Is their heart racing? Do they feel clammy? Do they feel like they're going to pass out? And then we want to teach them the relaxation strategies. So you might come up with things like additional information for guided relaxation. You might do some bubble breathing or other measured breathing assignments. And you can also do positive self-talk. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how that is an effective strategy. And then they can simply record their feelings, the strategies, and their engagement, because you want to show them that when I recognize these feelings, I use certain strategies that help me to focus more on my work. And I know that Eric Common and Wendy Oakes and Mark Buckman all have a project that's getting ready to start very soon on testing out some of those at tier 2. Another set of supports that we also are going to want to have available is a plan for what's needed if kids have even more intensive intervention needs for internalizing issues. And when we think about tier 3, we want to have a plan for tier 3 supports that can be managed in our building, as well as plans for things that can be done with outside community agency partners. So you might think about having 2 different intervention grids, one for what happens at tier 2 based on your district resources, and another one, tier 3 for your district resources, and another one for tier 3 in terms of community agency supports. And so one big category that we want to talk about is that of cognitive behavior therapy. And this is a tier 3 support for kids that we're going to talk about specifically for internalizing behaviors. And when we think about CBT, which you might have heard about, cognitive behavior therapy, we see thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And we, as part of this approach to therapy, we help kids to recognize that their thoughts influence how they're feeling and how they're behaving. And similarly, their feelings are also influencing what they're thinking and their behaviors. And then the behaviors are also contributing to their thoughts and their feelings. So when we think about the interactions of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and for some of you right now, you're thinking, wow, this sounds very similar to our curriculum in terms of like positive action. You're right. There's a really strong link there. There's many different approaches to cognitive behavior therapy and very many different elements, such as psychoeducational, cognitive restructuring, relaxation training, activity scheduling, and systematic desensitization. And what we're going to talk about specifically tonight as one of those tier 3 supports is cognitive restructuring. But I want to also highlight that Emily and Amy are actually leading another support that'll be built out in one of the modules. So if you're at a Project Enhance site, there'll be a whole set of really wonderful resources. I had an opportunity to look at much of it today, all on this idea about multiple different approaches, tier 3, for supporting kids with those needs. And the reason why we want to do a really, really good job for this is we want to make sure that when we're building these interventions, it's like building an individualized plan, similar to like an individualized de-escalation plan, in the sense that we want to teach kids the skills to be able to really enjoy life and have these new approaches to managing, recognizing, and managing their own anxiety that are generalizable in new settings and with new people and over time. And then we want to make sure that they also have the skill sets that they need not to be successful just in our school and our classroom, but in the broader days of their life. So when we think about these connections across the tiers, these connections thread through. These strategies can be embedded at tier 1. There's also low intensity supports that we can use. Like once kids learn these strategies, we can pre-correct them to say now might be a good time. Like if you're feeling a little bit anxious about getting on the bus to go home with other friends, this would be a good time to use our strategies, and you can work with the kids to identify what their own individual need is. And then we will notice that kids are actually engaging in their strategies and recording their behaviors. And so we want to recognize them sincerely and specifically with behavior-specific praise. So as we think about that cognitive restructuring piece, we're not suggesting that a classroom teacher set up to go do this. We are suggesting that this might be what the school psychologist or the social worker or the mental health team provider member does with the student in their building if they are screening as a tier 3 support, or this might be something that is also supported with a community agency partner. And basically the goal of this tier 3 support is to basically modify the cognitions that are associated with anxiety so that we can bring the anxiety down. So part of it is helping to identify these basically false beliefs or anxious thinking. And then we want to change the reality of those beliefs or thoughts. And then changing the thinking can lead to something that is a more rational or more probable outcome for the student. So as we think about doing this, the teaching involves making sure that we're giving the kids an opportunity to identify thoughts that may indeed feel somewhat or be somewhat irrational, and then go with something that is a little bit more measured in terms of expectation. We also want to learn from the kids, what are those irrational thoughts during anxiety provoking events? And those anxious events can be different for different people. Some people love being the center of attention or speaking in public. And for others, the anxiety is debilitating. And so we want to make sure that we identify what those events are and then help students to modify the irrational thoughts about how things can actually outcome. And there's a number of different strategies, some of which we can do with the kids directly, and some of which we can also help families to become aware of. And we'll talk about 4 of those before we close out today. But some of them are helping to decatastrophize. So to actually work through and realize that, it's not going to be, it's like if you're 10 minutes late for a meeting, the world is not going to fall apart. You sit down, you get engaged, and the world's not going to come to an end. There's also other things like other strategies like reframing and relabeling it in a more positive way. So, and sometimes, and these patterns of how kids are verbalizing is not going to always be out loud. Sometimes it's going to be in their mind. And so we need to make sure that we're having opportunities to learn from these kids, especially at this tier 3 support, to think about how are they processing this information? And then we want to set them up for success. As a tier 3, it could be an individual, it could be a small group led. And you would decide based on the resources in your school and your community what that's going to look like in terms of who is going to lead this effort. But again, this is a big investment and well worth it. So typically this would be provided over like 5 to 12 sessions. And just like any other tier 3 grid, we want to make sure that we're selective in terms of thinking about who needs additional support by looking at our entry criteria and everything that we do. We want to make sure that we're monitoring the student's performance, treatment integrity, as well as social validity, so that we can make a decision about how well it is working and when it is time to conclude it. And finally, we also want to make sure that we have an opportunity to know that another tier 3 support already exists in many of your interventions grids, and that is functional assessment-based interventions. And many of us on this call, Wendy, Eric, Mark, Paloma, we've all done these as far as like teaching them at the university level, conducting them in classrooms, but we want to find out what the maintaining function is of the behavior. So what is the return? Like, what is the communicative intent of those anxious feelings? Like, what is a kid accessing in terms of attention or tasks or activities or tangibles or sensory experiences, and what are they escaping? So what we're going to do right now in this next breakout is we're going to take 10 minutes to see which strategies you would like to explore. Would you like to think a little bit more about sharing back in your buildings about that relaxation training, learning a little bit more about self-monitoring, or perhaps more about a tier 3 support, either CBT or the functional assessment? What were some of the conversations about doing that relaxation at tier 1 as a tier 1 strategy? And this wouldn't replace the work that you're doing with your validated curriculum. So if you're already teaching lessons from Second Step or Positive Action or Connect with Kids, those are still part of what you're doing. And ideally, especially if your percentage of kids that needs more than tier 1 has to offer is beyond 80%. We want to, at tier 1, we want to make sure that you're really pulling in some of those lessons intentionally. But what did people think about the possibility of bringing in this tier 1 supportive guided relaxation at tier 1 for all students?
I have seen it at tier 1. And I think I shared this in our group that I feel like it works so well as a way, and Katie Austin brought this up in our group as well, for educators to get involved in modeling relaxation strategies and also taking an opportunity to engage in those strategies for themselves. And where I've seen it and seen it work well is to start off the day or following a transition back to classroom where maybe they were in PE or at recess or lunch or an activity that maybe we need to kind of bring the energy level back down and kind of refocus and get ready to engage. And I've seen it work really well in those specific blocks, and the kids enjoy it, the teachers enjoy it. It's just really great.
And that was my experience too as a teacher, especially when I was a middle school teacher. I was impressed with how some kids really found that it was helpful for a way to recenter and focus. And on occasion, I would even have kids ask, hey, can we do that thing one more time today? So they found it as a useful strategy, which was wonderful. And that was ages and ages ago. Wendy, do you want to share a little bit about your pre-service teachers and what they thought?
Well, I just used to have them every class period. Someone has to lead a relaxation activity, and they can choose whatever they want. And ideally, they're modeling something that they would use in their classrooms. But at first, there was a lot of like snickering and a lot of laughing, a lot of feeling uncomfortable. And by the time we got through a few sessions, they came in like looking forward to it as a way to sort of clear their mind and just focus on what was happening in class.
Yeah, I love that.
I also remember, and Kathleen, maybe you can tell this story if you remember, but years and years ago, I think about this teacher who was so far ahead of his time. We were in a high school in Pennsylvania. Hopefully that's not too narrow. And there was a teacher, and we were trying to get into that room because we were setting up for professional learning, and the door was shut and the lights were off, and we thought no one was in there. And then all of a sudden we heard, and look up into the sky and you'll see the stars. And it was like a camping scenario that he was describing. And then all of these students seniors, juniors, sophomores piled out of this room. And it was just such a
So awesome.
kind of a fun way to end a class, right?
Yeah. And I think you're right. And that was the end of the day. And it was just like so cool to see it in place. And so whether it's very young kids or all the way up through high school, and I think a lot of us, like for those of us who've used this personally or professionally, it's a really good tool. And that's why it's nice to expose it as a tier 1 practice. And there is evidence also support it as is it standalone and as a part of other tier 2 and tier 3 packages. So it's something that the child could actually draw back on. Did any groups get a chance to think about what it could look like in terms of doing a self-monitoring intervention at tier 2, just out of curiosity? Does that come up in conversation in any groups?
Kathleen, in our group, Carlo is talking about how her and her team looked at the self-monitoring accordion on the website. And they were really interested in. She did ask, they haven't seen it in action yet in terms of anxiety, like they've used it for other behaviors. And David was sharing that, he's also used it that with other behaviors as well. But we're definitely interested in hearing about if anyone has worked on it in action with anxiety.
So rather than having the kid monitor the number of times that they're feeling anxious or the number of times, because that can actually escalate it. It's like if you're thinking about it and then it gets higher and higher. So instead, like the approach that we've historically used is you're having the conversation with kids. Like, so you're doing this at tier 1, they might still be scoring in the tier 2 range in terms of internalizing issues. And you might have done other types of things like more intentional behavior specific praise or creating opportunities for kids to respond and be successful. But when we go in as a tier 2 support, oftentimes we will ask for parent permission to be able to have either them or the teacher, or sometimes both. And sometimes if the kid's like older than 8, they can actually fill out something like the social skills improvement system rating scale to find out, are there higher than average challenges for that child with internalizing issues, and then see what the kid is doing well and where they need some extra supports. And that all comes out in a report. And then what we will do is do some targeted skill sets for that child, like some specific relaxation strategies. So kind of identifying like, hey, it seems like you might feel a little bit anxious, or it might be hard for you to pay attention when we head into like reading instruction. And for sometimes it's even things like coming to participate in a tier 2 reading intervention. So the child comes in and they're very, very anxious about being called on. So some of the things that you might do with that vein for self-monitoring is you can teach them to self-monitor the use of the strategy. So you might teach them about like positive self-talk and reconceptualizing how you're framing these things. And we're going to show you some other family-based resources in just a second. And then teach them to monitor the use of those strategies. So like, I feel anxious. Did I use the strategy when I felt anxious? So there's like a feeling. And then in response to that, how did I manage it? Did I do positive self-talk? Did I do some breathing? Did I do some, guided imagery? Did I use any of those other strategies? And then at the same time, monitor their work completion, or it might be contributions to a conversation. And still others, we've even done some just very, very simple interventions where we would do things like give this kid 6 paper clips and say, I promise to not call on you today when we go into this tier 2 group or like your reading intervention group, but I do need you to participate 6 times today. And you can even do it during whole class instruction. And so you might say to the kid in whole class, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give you 6 paper clips. You participate whenever you want to. And every time you do, you just move a paper clip into your next pocket. And when you're out, you're out. But if you want to contribute more, you can, because what you're removing for that child is the anxiety of being called on. Because sometimes it goes like this to like, if my teacher calls on me, I'm not going to know the answer. If I don't know the answer, I'm going to get embarrassed. If I get embarrassed, I'm going to turn red. And if I can turn red, the kid's going to tease me. And then if they tease me, I'm not going to want to come back to school. And if I don't come back to school, I'm not going to graduate. And if I don't graduate, then I'm not going to get a job. And then I'm going to be homeless and I'm going to have no place to shower. And then I'm going to have to shower in a fountain. And I don't know how to get food. I don't, my Costco membership's going around. I don't have food samples. And all of a sudden this kid is homeless, getting free samples from Costco and showering in a fountain. And they're just being asked to contribute in class. So they've escalated themselves up. But sometimes we just want to break that chain in terms of that real negative self-talk. And then tier 3, I want to just close with one point on tier 3 before we switch topics, is I want to be clear, the school doesn't have to do it all in terms of having on-site experts for every single need that a child might have at tier 3. And there will be community agency people. And Emily, I appreciate you you're nodding your head that the point is we want to create transparencies about which children might need those extra supports from those providers. And remember, we're not listing the name of the person, we're listing the support that they provide. So you're thinking about like wraparound services or customized experiences or things like CBT. And then that's a big umbrella. So there could be things that are placed out in there, and the family becomes a big role in this. There was a time when people thought everything at tier 2 was small group and could be managed by a teacher or a reading specialist, and that everything at tier 3 was going to be an individual with an expert. And honestly, I just think about this as levels of intensity. And I think it came up in Wendy's group that like what you're doing at tier 1 can also be done with greater intensity at tier 2 or even tier 3. So it might be, we're doing guided relaxation as a tier 1 practice when kids come in after lunch or during the school day or after some things. And I might do it even more regularly as a standalone tier 2 support for Kathleen Lane. So maybe like I know that for her, this works well. And so I might actually make a self-monitoring intervention for her where I say, I would like you. It's like if David was my coach, he might say, all right, you've shared with me that you're feeling anxious at these times of the day. So at these 4 times of the day, what I would like you to do is just indicate if you are feeling anxious. And if you are, then you're going to use this strategy. And I want you to keep track of using that strategy. And then I want to have something like a direct behavior rating where you self-report like how you're feeling after you have done that relaxation activity. So then maybe I went from like a 10 when I came in and feeling really, really anxious to feeling really not anxious at all. Or I might even have that scale shifted, but you can do like a single item or a multiple item to direct behavior rating as a strategy. And Hope, thank you for bringing up that perspective in your group. So keeping all this in mind, and I think that's the benefit too of CI3T is that we keep talking about these as an integrated way. So like we might do this type of self-monitoring to monitor how a kid's feeling during reading intervention. It could be during different times of the day. It could be at tier 1. And I create that common language for people all the way through. The last group we wanted to talk about is thinking about resources to share with families. So these same exact things that we were talking about in terms of like cognitive restructuring, we would want to also make sure that we have a way to communicate these with families. And what we're showing you right now,
Kathleen, you want to make sure you're sharing your screen.
You cannot see in my head? Okay, thank you.
Not right now. Sometimes
squinting very hard, but I can't.
We're almost in there, people. In my mind, you're in there. And I appreciate you guys being patient with my computer issues. I've restarted and it seems to be better at this moment. So thank you, Katie. So when we think about communicating those strategies with parents, what you're looking at is an image right now of a resource that comes from the behavioral assessment system for children. It's called the BAS3 system. And these are literally not trifolds, but just like little resources that you can purchase and share out with families. And when we pre-pandemic used to meet in person at the Alumni Center, you would imagine yourself right now sitting and you'd have these on a table in front of you. But I want to show you just a little bit about what's in here. And if you wanted to look at these are not inexpensive, but they are not out of price and like out of range in terms of affordability. But like, for example, this one on dealing with anxiety, this could be another intervention that I could be doing these same things in the school system during the day with kids. And then I can show families how these could look if they wanted to thread that needle through to the home setting. So it tells the parent over here, like how that shows up. They might seem nervous or fearful or feeling worried. They might be overly serious. They might have this constant need for reassurance, and you might have that nut muscle tension. And then it gives them these 4 strategies. And so I just want to show you a little bit about what these strategies would look like. And it takes a lot of the same, more clinical types of terminology, and it translates that for them. So for example, there's one about positive storytelling. So you know how sometimes we tell ourselves scary stories, like the one I just talked through with you about showering in a fountain and looking for free food at Costco. So here the family might work with their child to figure out what's something that makes you worried. And for some kids, it's like leaving a parent to go to school, or they're worried about being made fun of, or they're worried that a parent is going to die. And then they help the child to create a story where that child is the main character. And they're basically using these details to illustrate how to handle that situation and using positive descriptions to describe their feelings and their thoughts and their behaviors. And so they can kind of visualize worry as a cartoon character, and they teach that child to think about their story of being a more positive version of themselves, and then provide feedback. So I'm going to read this to you, and this might be an illustration of positive storytelling. And I know I'm humbled by the number of school psychologists and others on the call. So if you want to add to this, feel free. This one says, when Yosef hears thunder, he hides in his closet, and Yosef's father sits with him after dinner and told him a story about space travel. Yosef loved any story of stars or planets, and his father asked Yosef to imagine himself in his own spaceship with his curved windows and its dials and its levers and the black space and stars outside. And Yosef's father asked him to imagine a planet exploding. It was loud like thunder, but Yosef wasn't afraid because his spaceship kept him safe. His father had him imagine his spaceship during the storm, and he felt braver when he heard the thunder. So he created a positive narrative. And you notice how he put him in the safe spaceship so that the planet exploding was far away from him and he was safe. So this is one illustration of positive storytelling. So telling your narrative. So rather than like if a kid is very, very anxious about like having to do public speaking at school, oftentimes we've heard people say like visualize it. So you walk through a scenario with this child and you think, you in your mind's eye, you walk up and you adjust the microphone and you have your notes and you look out and you see and you imagine, finding a friendly face in the crowd, blah, 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 blah. But you're helping them to paint a more positive outcome than the negative story that they're telling. And another strategy might be rewarding brave behavior. And in this, like the child's parents or caregiver could encourage a child to face anxious or fearful situations using some type of an acknowledgement or award. And so for here, you might make a list of brave behaviors for the child, and you start small and you move towards harder behaviors, and then work together gradually to basically encourage independence. And then for this, we want to think about acknowledgments or awards that are realistic of value and are available immediately after performing the behavior. But I want you to know that these scenarios are there for families because sometimes we're drawing on what we're doing right now. We're drawing on our past experiences. And sometimes we simply don't know what to do because all we know is that we don't know what to do for our kids right now. So we can do things like rewarding behavior, brave behavior. Another thing we can do is walk it all the way through of what's the worst possible thing that could happen. And you go work essentially through the worst case scenario. So it would be asking your child to say, what is the worst possible thing that could happen if that happened? Like if you miss the bus to come home from school, because like if a kid's worried about getting the bus and not getting home on time. And so then you would say, and you'd walk it through with them. And if that didn't happen, then I would call my mom. And then what if she wasn't available? Then who would you call next? But you walk them all the way through that thing and then help to put a realistic spin on it. So here, you can go through the worst thing, and then you can talk about what's the likelihood of it actually getting that far. And the bottom line is it probably wouldn't. Now, sometimes really catastrophically horrible things happen. And this is a tough one right now, coming out of the pandemic in particular. But we keep going into these worst case scenarios become things that the child can actually manage. And then we teach them the coping skills about how to get there. So let's take a look at one of these. This is about older kid. Let's take a high school age kid, complained a lot about his after school job and was critical of himself. And then he said that the other workers in the library didn't like him. And he said, what's the worst thing you could happen if your coworkers don't like you? And his father asked him. And he said that he could ask for tasks that he could do by himself. And what if he couldn't do work by himself? Then he realized that he could, if he absolutely wanted to, he could find another job. And then he's like, what if I couldn't find another job? And then he would do volunteer work. And once he got all the way down to it, and that kid realized, it's my choice to have this job. I don't have to have a job right now. I could do volunteer work. but I can stay here and I can make happiness. Now, there's a guy that I really like. His name's John Bright, and he's a big functional assessment-based intervention guy. And he always talked about it as help kids to find their own reinforcers and help adults do the same. So find things that hold value for you. So like the people I work with are some of the most important people in my life. Like a praise statement from people that I get to work with saying that something went well or that I managed something well. And like, Paloma, you were always so gracious to me about this stuff. Like, no matter how bad things go, like when I'm internalizing about this internalizing presentation tomorrow, I know you're going to do evaluating the worst case scenario, or perhaps the very last one, she'll go into some guided relaxation for me. But we want to make sure that we can help kids to have opportunities to engage in positive, productive strategies at school. And we want to thread the needle all the way through to the home setting. So if you would, in our last conversation for tonight, will you keep any student in mind from your school, from your building, from your pastor, a child of your own? And I'd like you to think about which of these might work for this specific child, or what's something that you would feel comfortable trying out or sharing with a family. So I'll catch you back in 10 minutes. So thank you for staying with us, and we'll see you back in 10. Welcome back. Such good conversations. And I really loved how people were talking about the practicalities of what to share with parents and how. And one of the conversations we had in a breakout room was like reframing is positive storytelling. So the technical term would be reframing. And correct me if you see this differently, but ideally, like we might have in a tier 2 intervention grid that maybe the teacher does a reframing strategy, or maybe it's the school psychologist that works with the child on just reframing, like retelling that story. And then maybe we put in parentheses, positive storytelling, so that if we're going to make it even more accessible for teachers, and then let parents know that this thing that we're sending home to share with you is the same thing that we're doing at the teacher's classroom. And that I think could be like a simple tier 2. So not a full individualized, like a cognitive restructuring thing, but maybe we do one little strategy. And I've seen some grids prepared where they will actually do more like multiple, like 5 rows of different cognitive behavior strategies, so that kids could, like the teachers could pick them. I've seen other people say, we're going to use cognitive restructuring. And then under that, they might list like these 4 things. And then they explain that it's like a menu, and then they're going to build that based on like what is preferable for the kid and for the family and for the teacher themselves. The teacher's view on this and degree of comfort is important. Like if a teacher is uncomfortable with these things and not feeling like they're getting enough training or support, they're way less likely to do that. So we want to think about these strategies and commit to professional learning on them in an accessible way. And I do want to say how much I truly, truly appreciate this group. As you know, this is the last session for this year on internalizing issues. And I think this is a really good one to kind of think about ending the year with, the academic year, because we've got a lot of kids out there, especially as you get ready to head into your spring screening. And I do want to say, Wendy and I went to a conference just recently, and I think it's important to remember that you guys are so great at your systematic screening efforts. Like you understand the value of why we screen 3 times a year. Fall lets us know where the kids are starting the year 4 to 6 weeks in. Fall to winter lets us know how kids are responding to tier 1 efforts, so that you know how to begin tier 2 and tier 3. And we need spring screening to not only know what to do right now in these final 6 weeks-ish or 4 weeks-ish of the school year, but we also have to be prepared to use these data to think about how we're going to make up our classes next year. And by that, I mean, people used to do these elaborate card systems to think about, what do I need to know about this kid to know which class to put them in next year? You have screening data to do that. And your spring screening data can also allow you to think about, what do families need to set up for success for their kids over the summertime? If you've got kids that are coming up as still having higher than average internalizing issues, these could be some great strategies to take back and share with family. So I applaud you. So thankful for you all. And I wish you a really safe and positive end of the school year. And thank you so much for hanging in there with our tech issues tonight. We're going to hang back if you have any questions, but just wishing you a lot of happiness as you wrap up this school year.